It started with a single mistake. Minutes later, it was one of the strangest nuclear disasters in U.S. history. It was a story of cover-ups, secrets, and maybe even murder. On today's episode of The Infographic Show, we're telling the story of the most radioactive corpse in American history. On the evening of January 3, 1961, three servicemen, Richard Dick Legg, 26, John Jack Burns, 22, and Richard McKinley, 27, arrived for what seemed like a routine job at the SL-1 reactor in Idaho's National Reactor Testing Station. It was the height of the Cold War. The US and the Soviet Union were spending fortunes racing to harness nuclear energy, but not always making safety the main priority. Jack, a New Yorker with a baby at home, was a happy-go-lucky daredevil known for his temper. He joined the Army, and when offered a place in the nuclear program, he jumped at it. The pay was too good to refuse. Dick was a father of three from rural Michigan, loved hunting and the outdoors, so quiet Idaho suited him fine. The two had trained together at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, where they spent 4 grueling months learning reactor operations, running malfunction drills, cold startups, shutdowns, and emergency scram procedures. Both passed psychological exams and were deemed intelligent and stable enough for reactor duty. But just how true that last part was would later become a matter of intense scrutiny. They both dreamed of becoming atomic pioneers in a world that was changing at hyperspeed. The US, like the Russians and the British, were now able to generate electricity from nuclear power, not to just blow up cities. In 1955, the Idaho site made history as the first place in the world where a nuclear reactor powered an entire town. Arco, population just a few hundred. But soon it would make history again, for something far darker. By the time the men arrived there in 1959, the site had 52 reactors, more than anywhere on Earth in one place. But together they'd already experienced 27 meltdowns, 9 intentional ones as safety tests, the rest small accidents without loss to human life. But that was about to change. Inside a reactor, uranium atoms split, releasing neutrons that strike more atoms, creating a chain reaction. Too fast and the reaction overheats or explodes. Control rods, or long metal rods made of boron or cadmium, absorb those stray neutrons, push them in and the reaction slows or stops, pull them out and it speeds up. Cold rods are tested before startup, hot rods during operation. It's all about balance. Routine work, but deadly if done wrong. Jack and Dick both knew that pulling a control rod out too far would be catastrophic. Pulling one out really far on purpose seemed almost unthinkable. It would take effort and it would mean certain death. It was a challenging and often stressful job. If you included the bus ride to the desert, they worked 10-hour days. So when they returned to work after the Christmas holidays, they were re-energized. It was the evening shift. Dick had been at a post-Christmas party earlier in the day, and he was in a terrible mood. He'd just been told that because of his behavior, he might have to be transferred, maybe even kicked out of the nuclear program entirely. It was his dream job, the only way he could support his large family. He stood up face to face with his boss as if to throw a punch. When he clocked in for work later that day at the reactor room, he knew what he had just done could have ruined his career in atomic energy. Jack's life was also in tatters. His marriage was so rocky that he wasn't sleeping at home. He was totally broke and 2 beers in when he arrived for his shift that day. For years now, he'd often fought with his wife, Arlene, the two having screaming matches at least once a week. And when Jack partied, he partied hard. Then on the weekends, he often went into the hills to be alone when he wasn't visiting prostitutes. To observers, Jack was not cut out for being a dad in a marriage that seemed to suffocate his free, selfish, and often reckless spirit. That day, Jack's worst enemy walked through the door, Dick. He wasn't supposed to be there, and the two men despised each other. Their orders were to perform a pump down, reassemble the rods, perform cold rod drops, check for leaks, perform hot rod drops, and start up normally. They'd both done this before, but it was the first time Dick had done it as the supervisor. The third operator, Richard McKinley, a dedicated father of 2 from Ohio, didn't have a history with Jack and Dick. He was new, just 3 weeks out of training. At age 27, he had a lot of military experience, but that day, he was the amateur in the room. The day shift chief, Sergeant Stolla, knew all about Jack. As one of the so-called atomic couples, Stolla lived near Jack and Arlene, and he heard the constant fighting, the screaming, the smashing of glasses. When Jack clocked into work, Stolla said he looked out of sorts, nervous or stressed about something. He had that glint in his eyes that Stolla knew to mean Jack was in one of his foul moods. He didn't know it at the time what Jack had been going through at home. At 7 p.m., Arlene had called Jack on the work phone. She was furious. Their marriage was over. She wanted a divorce and half of his last paycheck. Arlene later calmed down and tried calling again, but Jack wouldn't take the call. She wanted to talk things over, maybe tell him she'd give it another go. The receptionist took 3 more calls from her, but Jack didn't take any of them. Years later, Jack's state of mind that day would become a major talking point. His reckless attitude had started to affect his work. His supervisor said he was not ready for a promotion, which Jack had thought was nailed on. He was a smart guy, but with an explosive temper, not a good trait for someone running a nuclear reactor. He was hard to handle, said one of his colleagues. His attitude often toxic, shouting, throwing tools around, scaring people, and when he wasn't exploding, he was morose, a dark cloud over his head. He often felt bitter when most of his classmates from Fort Belvoir got promotions to supervisory roles and he was stuck as a basic operator. Friends said he was ashamed and embarrassed, going from angry outbursts to quietly fuming. As for Dick, he'd done better after training, passing more exams, setting himself up for future nuclear work in the civilian world. Still, like Jack, he was a hothead, having temper tantrums at work when things didn't go his way. His supervisors later said it must have been his short man complex. Dick was about 5'6", a know-it-all, and pushy once he'd been promoted to chief operator. But even then, he had a bad habit of playing pranks. He'd turn on the alarm at the reactor just to scare others. One day, he turned off the fan and the system overheated. People panicked and Dick just laughed and turned it back on. After too many incidents like this, including sleeping in his car and also clocking in for his absent co-worker and friend, the superintendent said enough is enough. Just before Christmas, the supervisor transferred Dick's friend out of SL1 and told him that Jack Burns would take the guy's place. 6 months earlier, they had gotten into a vicious fistfight at a bachelor party. A friend said after the fight, Jack became like a smoldering volcano, and now the 2 men were going to work together in the new year, a recipe for a nuclear chain reaction. Arlene tried to call Jack one last time just before 9 p.m. No one even picked up the phone. That was unusual. The receptionist wondered if something had happened, so she made some calls. 8 miles away down the dark desert road, the alarm was raised at the fire station. The time was 9:01. It was 1.6 degrees Fahrenheit outside, snow everywhere, so the guys hoped it would be a false alarm. 9 minutes later, the fire crew pulled into the yard outside the SL1 building. Radiation alarms were blaring, but from a distance, everything looked fine. The response team worked their way down a narrow passageway, past 3 cups of undrunk coffee and untouched lunchboxes. There was no fire, no smoke, just an eerie sense that something was wrong. Where were the operators? One of the firefighters pulled out a radiation level detector. The device's max reading was 500 Röntgens, which in proximity is enough to damage internal organs and bone marrow, lethal if exposed for too long. The closer they got to the reactor room, the needle shot up, like a Porsche in a drag race, one of the firefighters later said, adding, "We'd never seen a reading like that before. They thought it must have malfunctioned." Thankfully, they had the sense to get out. It was 9:35. Health physicists wearing protective clothing and masks went in as the firefighters shivered in the cold outside in the car park. The room was covered in water from the cooling reactor. The reactor itself had been blown open, the core exposed, twisted metal everywhere. Radiation was now at extreme levels, but there was still no sign of the operators. As buses with night shift workers were turned around and a roadblock was set up, the signal went out. Class 1 disaster. It reached all the way back to Washington, to the generals, admirals, even the president. Inside the building, they found the missing men. Well, 2 of them. McKinley was next to the control panel, moving, moaning, alive. Jack, blood oozing from his head, was near one of the reactor shields, almost certainly dead. And Dick was nowhere to be seen. One of the men cried for help through his fogged-up mask. It was too dangerous to stay inside, but they had to try to save McKinley. They lifted him onto a stretcher and carried him to an ambulance, strapping a respirator over his mouth. Half of his face was gone, and his body was dangerously radioactive. At 11:14 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Moments later, monitors showed the ambulance itself was now emitting lethal radiation. The drivers were in danger. Everyone who had gone near the building scrubbed themselves with decontamination soap, silently praying that they wouldn't start showing signs of poisoning. Jack was dead. But where was Dick? Men can't just disappear. They searched through the leaked radioactive gas, and then one of them saw it. He glanced up, his flashlight scanning a mutilated body. Dick was pinned to the ceiling, impaled by a control rod, blood dripping to the floor below. About an hour later, the military commander at SL-1 knocked on the house door of Arlene. She took one look at him and fell into his arms. This was top secret. He couldn't tell her everything, only that Jack was dead. The wives of the 2 other men were also kept in the dark, told only that there had been an accident. Any news of a nuclear accident would panic the American public, and worse, it would be a feather in the cap for the Soviets. A man impaled on a ceiling because of American negligence and capitalist hubris. It was gold dust to a communist propagandist. McKinley's body was so contaminated that the ambulance driver wore a lead-lined vest. He drove for about an hour, and another driver took over not before downing a shot of liquor for Dutch courage. They drove to a chemical plant, and workers in full protective clothing dragged McKinley out of the back and placed him in a steel tank, covering him with ice and alcohol. The next day, they extracted Jack. Radiation levels measured 750 Roentgens, so the work was done in shifts. It took 6 days for a team from a special radiological unit to get Dick down from the ceiling, with a crew helping, a dozen guys with poles, a crane, and a net to catch him. Contaminated items taken from the building were carefully stored in a cask lined with 4 inches of lead. It was a major moment in American history. Nothing like this had ever happened anywhere in the world. But the question was, how did it happen? The initial investigation concluded that, for reasons that remained very unclear, Jack had pulled the central control rod up more than 20 inches, far beyond the 4 inches required to start the reactor. That single motion was enough to drive the reactor from stable to supercritical in milliseconds, and Jack would have known exactly what that meant. It was an almost impossible mistake to make. Pulling the 84-pound control rod that high would have taken a lot of effort, even with the counterbalancing system. The reactor's power surged to over 6,000 times its rated output. The sudden heat vaporized the water, creating a massive steam hammer that blew the top off of the reactor. The entire 26,000-pound vessel was lifted nearly 9 feet into the air, throwing metal everywhere. The blast hurled the fuel rods outward into the containment walls, pinning Dick's mangled body to the roof. The story hit the press as politicians tried to answer awkward questions without giving up too many details. For them, it was a national security issue. For the families, they just wanted the truth. They wanted their loved ones back so they could bury them. Little did they know the Atomic Energy Commission was still talking about disposing of the bodies in high-radiation waste pits. Still, that wouldn't look good for the American government, which was now in crisis mode, engaging in what some would later claim was a cover-up. After very tricky autopsies, the men's bodies were wrapped in thick lead sheets, bound in metal and encased in a special coffin. The coffins were then placed in a lead vault, inside of which was a label, "Caution, High Radiation Area." The vaults of Jack and Dick were flown on a C-54 and taken to their hometown cemeteries in accordance with the family's wishes. There, a cement truck poured cement into deep graves. Radiation could still be detected through the vaults, so the families had to stand 20 feet back during the funeral service. When it was done, the cement truck filled in the holes. McKinley's body was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery, not at the reactor site as was first reported. The grave comes with a warning: body is contaminated with long-life radioactive isotopes. Under no circumstances will the body be removed. Rumors swirled for many years, mostly because the Army kept the details so secret. In 1961, the final verdict had been the cause of the rapid withdrawal of the central control rod could not be conclusively determined. Some wondered if the rod had gotten stuck, but that, too, seemed almost impossible to people who understood how the reactors worked. It had never happened before, and it never should happen, but freak accidents are rarely predictable. Still, operators testified that Jack could not have made such a catastrophic mistake. It would be like a barber accidentally stabbing his customer. One operator was asked, "Did you know that the reactor would go critical if the central control rod were removed?" He replied, "Of course. We often talked about what we would do if we were at a radar station and the Russians came. We'd yank it out." Even now in the 2020s, a former nuclear safety analyst at the Idaho National Laboratory said it would have been practically impossible for Jack to make that mistake. If it really was sabotage, that was definitely not a narrative that worked well for the US government. It was much worse than negligence in terms of Cold War optics, a sign of American dysfunction, of moral decay, and maybe that's why major newspapers ignored the sabotage angle. Even after Dr. Stephen Hanauer, an investigator with the Atomic Energy Commission, said it was definitely a case of murder and self-annihilation, and Richard McKinley, whose wife was pregnant, was just caught in the middle. Dr. Hanauer added another twist. He said there was a lover's triangle, that Dick had been sleeping with Arlene, but that could have been the AEC trying to blame human error for a badly designed reactor in an industry worth a lot of money. It took years for the full picture to emerge. Jack and Dick's anger issues were very real. Jack was at the end of his tether, broke, thinking his wife had just left him, and he'd been told to work under a man he despised and envied, so maybe sabotage wasn't out of the question. That was the first time a reactor caused the loss of lives. But if you want to see a disaster on a much bigger scale, watch Chernobyl Nuclear Explosion Disaster Explained Hour by Hour, or check out this video instead.